It's my pleasure to introduce Harald Baayen. But before I do that, I'll just thank Dom and Kim and Carmen and Natalie and sort of all of the local organizers for doing so much work. So there were a few of us who were external organizers, but everything went so smoothly that we really didn't have all that much we had to do. So we appreciate that, and we're continually impressed by everyone's hard work. So as I said, my pleasure to introduce Harald Baayen. Harald is the Humboldt Professor of Quantitative Linguistics at the University of Tübingen. He's also the Professor of Quantitative Linguistics at the University of Alberta in Canada. Harald has been doing lots and lots of really fascinating and important work on morphology over the last 20-odd years. He's worked quite a bit on morphological processing and morphological productivity, and has really informed our theories and sort of empirical knowledge about those subjects. He's worked on a number of languages, Dutch and English and others, and has collaborated with sort of more people than I could enumerate here. But we also know Harald from his work more specifically on quantitative methods and statistical methods, and sort of all the work that he's done to popularize and help many of us use the R language, and to develop and sort of distribute tools for doing statistical and visualization in the R language. I know personally his 2008 book, Analyzing Linguistic Data, has been sort of crucial for my own work, and so I thank him for that. So without further ado, I will let Harald get us started, and I think on behalf of all the organizers and everyone here, we're thrilled to have him for this first keynote at AVML. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me here. It is a great pleasure. Thanks for the nice introduction. What I would like to do today is tell you a bit about an adventure that I'm on in trying to learn to work with generalized additive models. I think that these kind of models have a lot of potential, and one of the fun things about them is that visualization and modeling are the same in that kind of environment. But let me begin with maybe one of the earliest visualizations in the domain of regression. This is from Galton's work on the length of children and the length of parents. And it shows you a hand-drawn ellipse. You can even see the different line segments of the ellipse that have been drawn. This is more than 100 years ago. And this is also the graph from which the term regression has its name. And you can see that we have something that looks like a bivariate normal distribution and looks nicely linear. Now, one of the things that have been recently discovered is that if you look more carefully at this data set, then you find that the relation is not strictly linear. So it's all very nice to have a linear regression, but as probably most of you know, things are not always straight. And it even turns out that if you do not, say, average in clever ways around fathers and mothers and daughters and sons, but you split things up so that you have the height of the son and the height of the father and the height of the mother and the height of the daughter, then you can see, for instance, in the upper right graph that things are pretty linear, but in the lower right graph that things are not that linear. Yeah? So these kind of easy ways of plotting things were not available 100 years ago, but they show that things are probably a bit more complex than people thought. Now, what is interesting is that when Galton formulated his this particular model, this regression model, he had theoretical reasons for believing that it should be a bivariate normal distribution. And I find this interesting because in a lot of the applications, a lot of the models that I've done, often we don't have a substantive theory motivating why particular variables should have a distribution of one or other types. You're using, as it were, the statistical techniques as a means of getting some knowledge about whether we should be surprised about how our effects fall out. But they're not directly and straightforwardly part of our, say, in our case, linguistic theory as to why we don't have intrinsic motivations as to why these things have the form that they take. So what I want to do this morning is talk a bit about two-dimensional and more-dimensional smooths, so moving away from the linearity, and also talking a bit about making sense of the results you get. And visualization is very important there. But also what you find when you visualize also often can pose lots of new challenges and basically forces us to think more about theory. So here is a graph of what you can accomplish in terms of nonlinear surfaces when you just take the standard linear model. So we have some response variable y, and we have two numerical predictors x1 and x2, and we can have a so-called multiplicative interaction, which you obtain by simply multiplying the two out. And what you get out of that is shown in the perspective plot on the right. Now, that perspective plot is rather horrible to read, but it looks very much like the standard crossover interaction that many of you will be familiar with when you have two factorial predictors, and instead of having just parallel lines, you can have lines that go like this or like that, and the way that this is visualized gives you the numerical equivalent for, say, numeric predictors of what you would get in analysis of variance if you had two factorial predictors and a crossover interaction. Now, this visualization is difficult to read. This one is maybe a bit easier. You know, there are these, we can even, go away. We can rotate the thing around. Quite nice, but the best way of visualizing for me is just a contour plot. Yeah, you don't have to rotate things. You get everything nice and clear. Some people have great difficulties interpreting those perspective plots, so however cool they may be, this is easy. Here you can see, and I'll be using these kind of plots a lot, what, in this case, a very symmetrical hyperbolic plane looks like. So green is down, and more red and white is up. So you can see that here, if you go here, you're, as they were climbing up, crossing a pass and going down, and then you have mountains on either side. That's the shape of this surface. And just as when you do a linear regression with just a line, you always look at the line segment. When you use a multiplicative interaction, you are using part of this kind of surface. So you could be only looking at something that looks like this quadrant, or you might be looking at something that looks like that. But you're always looking at part of such a surface. Now, such a surface is nice. Often you can get away with it, more often you can't. And then if you try to look for an interaction, then you don't find one, and that is not because there is not something, you're not dealing with a flat surface, but simply because what you are seeing is so different from this kind of hyperbolic plane that a hyperbolic plane doesn't fit. And since I have been discovering these models, I'm in a process of going back to many of my old data sets because it turns out that there is much more going on than I ever thought. But I just wasn't using the right kind of tool. So I'll talk a bit about regression splines, then thin plate regression splines, and most about tensor products. So regression splines are useful for wiggly lines. Here is a graph that shows you on the horizontal axis the log of frequency. I think it's Alex frequency, but if you do it with BNC frequency or Google frequency, very similar things happen. And on the vertical axis, you have the log of the reaction time in lexical decision. Blue are young speakers, and red are old speakers, 70-year-olds. So you see the older speakers tend to be a little bit slower. There is an interaction between these groups, but I want to ask you to look at is just the shape of the curve. Why does this curve have this shape? So what we're using here are regression splines. The idea is simple. We chop the horizontal axis up into a couple of intervals, and we fit a cubic polynomial to each of the intervals and make sure that where they connect smoothly. And that gives us a very flexible little black box that will tell us what the shape of the curve is. One of the very nice things about the GAMS package is that you as a user don't have to worry about how many knots, how many intervals you create, because, say, for instance, the splines in Harald's book, so the HMISC and the RMS packages, as they're now called, there you still have to decide as a user how smooth you want to work, and that's a problem. The nice thing with the MGZV package by Wood is that this is not something that you have to worry on because estimating the parameters for the regression spline is part of the whole estimation process. So we have this technique. Now the question is, why do the curves look the way they do? And this is a serious question, and in many of the cases that I'm working with, I don't have a good answer. So I'm going to give you a very biased kind of view on this, and I'm going to give you a few examples where I managed to find something of an explanation. Yeah? But remember that I should confess there are many cases where it doesn't work that well and where I have much more work to do. So in this case, it turns out that a very simple learning model will explain the shape of the curves. It's a model that I've been working on for understanding how you go from letter and letter bigrams to word meanings. So here you see a very simplified example. You have letter bigrams on the bottom. You have words on the top. Now, the word cade on the upper left is a legal Scrabble word in English. It's an extremely useful little word. It's something like a tribal chieftain. What is nice is that if you have a Q and no U, but you have an A, yeah, then there are 2 or 3 others that start with QA, you have a real advantage. And what this example shows is that something like QA has a very high Q validity for the word cade, whereas something like ID, for instance, has a very low Q validity because it's shared with lots of other words. Now, it turns out if you take these very simple principles, you just say, okay, different letters and letter combinations have different Q validity for the different meanings of the word we know, then there are methods to estimate all these weights from corpus data, and it turns out that the total support for the words that you get correlate quite well with reaction times. And here you can see the data that I just showed you, and this is what we simulate. Now, in this case, our young subjects are subjects who have only encountered 500,000 trigrams from the Google trigram corpus, and the old subjects have more experience. They have experienced 3 million trigrams, and you can see that we get roughly similar patterns. So it is possible that we get these inflections in the curves simply as a consequence of the frequency with which words are distributed in the language, the frequency with which letters co-occur within words. We train the model not only on single words, but on word trigrams. Given that, we are starting to see that these kind of patterns could be the result of a, say, a dynamic system. That's what I think is probably going on here. Here's another example of where a spline is very useful. This is work done by Ingo Plagg and his colleagues on stress in triconstituent English compounds. So you have things like hay fever treatment and family Christmas dinner. Ingo has been spending a lot of time looking at stress or prominence or whatever you want to call it. There are, of course, all kinds of wonderful theories around, but one of the things that you can do is you can take the F0 tracker, maybe connect pieces where there is no fundamental frequency, smooth it a bit, and take this as input to a generalized additive model. And if you do that, then we get these kind of graphs for the different kinds of compounds. So we have left branching compounds up here, right branching compounds down here. Here the stress is on the first, and here on the second, and here on the second, and there on the third noun. You very clearly can see, for instance, that there's a big prominence up here. The fun of this is that we don't have to make any discretization decisions. We can just try to model the flow of F0 across many different compounds, and perhaps it will allow us to move away from theories that really have to posit very discrete kind of changes at various points in time. One of the nice things is that these kind of smooths are very easy to make if you use the MGV package. Here, a smooth in time, and then if you have different factor levels, here we have 4 levels for the different kinds of compounds, then all you have to do is bias branching. What is also very nice is that Wood has been incorporating random effects. So you can do generalized additive mixed models, which is really nice. So here we have random intercepts for speaker and random intercepts for item in the model as well. So it's a real step forward compared to Elmer, where the LME4 package by Doug Bates. I think that in the future that is going to be the package for working if you have functional specifications of nonlinearities, and if you have no functional a priori specification, then I think that the GAM package in its most recent, this works well only for, say, 2 months or so. But it's really nice to be able to have random intercepts within a GAM approach. So, that was wiggly lines. Now, wiggly surfaces. Thin plate regression splines, I've scanned this from Wood's book. The idea is simple and beautiful. What you do is you build up a wiggly surface out of simpler geometrically regular surfaces by giving each regular surface its own weight. So you can take the egg box over here and put it all and add that to this, and then maybe add that to it and a little bit of this, and you will get a weird kind of surface. And by changing the weights for the different regular surfaces, you can generate just about any kind of surface that you want. These methods are recommended when you work with predictors on the bottom, say your x and y, that are isometric, things like geometric coordinates. So if you have things that are not on the same scale, then these methods should not be used. The method that I use most often is called a tensor product. I will freely confess here that I don't understand the mathematics of tensor products. My son is a mathematician. I asked him, and he looked at me sadly and said, "Dad, it's too difficult for you." So I accept that. Here is my layman's version. What you do is you define two basis functions, which themselves can be splines. One is on the one axis, the other one is on the other, and then you create a surface that respects these two functions as best as possible. So this function on the x, whenever you make a cross slice across parallel to the x-axis, it will try to resemble this, be as faithful as possible to this function. And if you do it along this dimension, then you have to be as faithful as possible to that. So it's a very beautiful method. You define two marginal functions, and you can multiply them out such that you get a surface that's completely determined by those marginals. These are universally applicable, they are fast, and they work very well. It's fun to see that a couple of years ago on Simon Wood's webpage, there was a nice graph of something like this with in big letters underneath, "It works," you know. It's been some time before these things really start to work in such a way that you can build it in, put it into a package, and be confident that when other people are using it, it's doing the right kind of thing. Okay, so here is an example from dialectometry. What you see here is a display of the pronunciation distance from Standard Dutch. So this is data that was collected by a couple of Dutch and Flemish linguists. Funnily enough, when I was a grad student, a lot of this data was being collected, and we were working in a terminal room where, 20 terminals hooked up to a little baby fax machine that has less power than any laptop around in the world that's still functioning right now. So I saw these data being collected and typed in and never thought that I'd work with them. The idea here is that the distance measure use a kind of modification of the Levenshtein distance. The standard form of Dutch is spoken just southwest of Amsterdam, and it's not surprising that in all of these graphs you can see that that's where you find the smallest distances from Standard Dutch. Now, what goes into the GAM model here is basically the distance from Dutch, the longitude, the latitude, and also the frequency of the word. So one of the fun things that you can now start doing is integrating geographical information with information of all kinds of other regressors. So in this model, this is work that was done by Martin Wieling and John Arbon, with a bit of my involvement. You can bring in socioeconomic status, number of inhabitants in a town, all of those kind of things can be brought into the model. In this case, what we have is a three-way interaction. We have longitude and latitude and word frequency all interact. Now that becomes difficult to display. So I have shown you here 4 plots characteristic of the first quarter of the data, the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter of the data. And what you can see as you move from left to right is that the area that is green slowly becomes a little bit smaller. And for instance, here in the north, you can see that the distance from the standard is greatest for the highest frequency words. So one of the, we found this very puzzling actually. We thought long about it, but this is simply telling us that the higher frequency words are more resistant to the standard language. So there's a lot of dialect leveling going on in the Netherlands, and where it's happening seems to be the low frequency words. And from a processing perspective, a psycholinguistic perspective, that makes sense, because the low frequency words are the words that you don't use that often. They are less well entrenched in memory, And hence, if you are bombarded regularly with standard versions of those words, then those are the words that are going to be, as it were, accommodate to the standard first. But it was puzzling to us because, for instance, in Bloomfield's book from 1933 on language, there's an extensive discussion of the work by the Dutch dialect researcher Kryuckova, who argued that it is the high-frequency words that accommodate to the standard first. Now, the actual picture, is maybe a little bit more complicated. So here, as you go through the different plots, we are moving through frequency. So we're going from low to high frequencies. And if I do it stepwise, let's see whether that works. Not on this machine. You can see that there is a little bit of an irregularity, but if you do the analysis, you can bring out a main trend such that as frequency increases, generally all the distances become somewhat greater. But you see here the kind of visualization possibilities that you have. We have a three-way numerical interaction, so we're basically looking at a four-dimensional space, and we can get 3 dimensions already by using a flat surface with color coding, and then bring the fourth in by means of time. Okay, so that is an example of one thing that you can do with these methods. Here is a very different example from lexical processing. One of the interesting things in the literature is that a word like cat can prime taxi, and cat is similar to cab, and cab is a synonym of taxi. Tooth, brush, hair. Now, if you think about these kind of semantic relations and their consequences for lexical processing, then compounds are potentially interesting. You have school, which is linked to bus through a compound school bus, and you have bus stop, so school might prime stop. And you have T and trolley bus, so T might prime bus. Okay? I've been very interested over the years in these kind of relations within compounds, and one of the effects that we have seen is that if a word is used in lots of other words, then it is generally read faster. However, if you think about it from this perspective, you could think that activation would spread from school to bus, but if it spreads from bus to stop, then you should get an epileptic fit, because all kinds of nonsense is activated when you read the word school. All kinds of stuff that you don't want to be activated. So that is why I started looking into what I call a secondary family size. So the primary family size are the words that a word is related to through the morphology, and then you have secondary family sizes when you go to the words that those words are related to. So school and stop and T and bus are secondary family members. And what you see in general is that if a word has many secondary family members, then you're reading them slower. Yeah? So they hurt. The primary family size helps, but the secondary family size slows you down in tasks like lexical decision. So here you see a little section of the English compound graph. What you can do is you can take all the compounds of English, and every constituent is going to be a node, and you put an arrow between two constituents when the first one is the modifier and the second the head in an existing compound of English. So here you have soup, and it goes to garden as a secondary family member, and from soup you can also get to maid. It turns out that within English, there is one gigantic, strongly connected component, so that means that from any modifier you can just keep going and then go to any head. Of course, there's lots of compounds that are not part of this strongly connected component, but there's the connectivity there is can be traced. It has processing consequences. One of them is interesting. You can make cycles. So you have fire, fly, fly, paper, paper, back, back, bone, bone, fire. Yeah? And then you're back where you began. There are longer ones, there are shorter ones. There are algorithms for finding the shortest path from a modifier back to itself. And from a spreading activation perspective, a question that you can ask is, well, if activation is spreading in such cycles and it comes back to where you began, then you get uncertainty of whether fly is the head or the modifier. Is it the head of firefly or is it the modifier of flypaper? Can you imagine? If activation just spreads from compound to compound, then you might get into problems. And this is where the GAMS, again, turn out to be interesting. If you just do a multiplicative interaction, you don't see that much. But we get a surface that looks like this. This here is the log of the left constituent's family size. It tells you how many outgoing paths there are from the modifier. This here is the log of the shortest path length. So how long is the path that takes you back to the modifier? And you can see that there is something of a ridge here. So here you're low, high, low. Here you're low, high, low. But this ridge climbs up. And then here there are a few points where it's maybe saying that things go up again. But there's very few data points out there. So what one can do is actually simplify this surface. I'm not going to go into it, and simplify it to something that is mathematically well described. And here you have that ridge back. So this is an attempt to take a surface that is estimated by a GAM and then give it a mathematical formulation. And I could spend lots of time talking you through what all of that stuff means, but the interpretation is fairly straightforward. The idea then is that the amount of time required for activation to reach the modifier is proportional to the shortest path length. Yeah? So if activation spreads, if it is having to do a long, long walk, then there is little activation that's going to arrive, saying that as each transition you lose a bit, so that's not going to give you a strong effect. But if the path is very short, then you're going to have a stronger effect. Second idea here is that the amount of time required for sufficient activation to accumulate to be disruptive is proportional to the modifier family size. So if you are at a modifier and it has just 2 splits, then both splits get a lot of activation. But if there are 50 splits, then each split gets just a little bit. Yeah? So if there's a lot, basically, it's dividing a pie between just a few or many. And if you have just a few, then everybody gets a large slice, and that means that there's a lot of activation that's going to appear. And that might explain why you get a pattern like this. If the modifier family size is large, then you're going downhill. But there is a critical window in time where the path is just so long that it gives you maximal disruption. I don't think, personally, that this model is the correct one. I'd be much more inclined now to try to model this in terms of discrimination learning. But we have a discrimination learning model for naming, for reading aloud simple words, but not for complex words. So here is a very different application of wiggly surfaces. And now going to EEG data. I don't know whether there's anybody here who has been running experiments with, say, ERPs. So basically you put a cap on somebody's head and you have all these electrodes that monitor changes in the microvoltages at the scalp due to, say, lots of processes, including some linguistic processes. And the way that these data are typically modeled in psycholinguistics is that you build factorial designs contrasting some normal versus some violation condition. So you might be familiar with the N400, which is a negativity arising 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So you have something, John ate the pie, and you have another sentence, John ate the door, and everybody says door, and 400 milliseconds later you get a warning bell. That N400 crops up with all kinds of surprises, not only linguistic surprises, but the wrong note in a melody and the wrong shoe on a, the left shoe on a right foot. Everything will create N400s. But the consequence of this, you have two conditions, normal, violation condition. Then you aggregate across all observations within each factorial condition. And then you do repeated measures ANOVA for time intervals where graphical inspection indicates the curves diverge. That's basically the way you publish in this field. And that has lots of disadvantages. You can do that with factorial predictors, but if you want to do regression in ERP studies, then you're stuck. Even with things like frequency, what you have to do is dichotomize high frequency versus low frequency. But dichotomization of numerical predictors is about the worst that you can do. It's loss of power, it can be misleading, you cannot detect interactions. So what you really need is a kind of flexible form of regression that allows the modeling of nonlinearities in high-dimensional multivariate space. So this is where the GAMS, again, are very useful. So what we do is we take the signal at an electrode and we do not do any averaging. We just take the signal, we have time, and at each time point we know what subject is responding to what item, what the microvoltage is, and then we may have subject properties and item properties and experimental properties, and we bring them all in. And then we model subject trends over time, item trends over time, and we can look at how the effects of numerical predictors changes over time. So here is a graph that gives you a bit of an idea of how this works. So this here is the grand average at a particular electrode. I think it is FZ, somewhere in the middle of the head. Just the grand average. So you can see that the microvoltage is going down a bit, and up, and then down. Now, this is really averaged across all words and all subjects. But a particular subject will not show this. In fact, you have a correction for a particular subject to this graph, which is shown here. And if you add the brown and the green, then you get the top curve here. And we can adjust that for what item we are listening to, and it goes down a bit. And then here you get a tensor product graph with time here and here, a particular dimension that we were interested in, namely the danger that is expressed by a word. So some words refer to very neutral things like desk, but knives and guns and poison all express things that are dangerous. And Lee Worm at Wayne State has done a lot of research showing that words that refer to dangerous things are responded to more quickly than words that refer to neutral things. That's by itself interesting because, and the funny thing is that in his experiments it never interacts with anything else. It looks like its own dimension. It's not correlated with frequency, and it makes one think about the evolutionary sources of such a phenomenon. It's of course important that we respond quickly in situations of danger. If you see a tiger and 500 milliseconds later you say, hey, that's a tiger, interesting, and then comes the information, ooh, tiger is dangerous, you might have already been eaten. So that our processing system responds very quickly to dangerous situations is good. There's actually a theory by, I think, Ledoux, who argues that there are subcortical pathways that take you straight to the amygdala and from there back to the cortex, so that if you encounter something that's dangerous, then you quickly also activate adrenaline, and the whole system will be on the alert, ready for a fight or flight. So that predictor is what we have here. Now, if you take one cross slice, then you get a curve like this. Yeah? So you can look at a wiggly surface like this as a summary of lots of different single curves, but one for each little band of danger values. So we can take this and that curve and add them up, and then we get that curve. So at the end of the day, we have decomposed and that's nicely explains also the term generalized additive models. It's still additive. We're adding all kinds of components, some of which we model with splines, some of which might be modeled with, this is not straight, but it's almost straight. Yeah. Could have parametric components in there. We can have these tensor product black boxes, but they allow us to decompose the signal in such a way that we can capture a lot of different aspects of the data. So here is one way of looking at this, and together with Antoine Tremblay in Halifax, we have been working, he has been doing most of the work on developing an R package for doing these kind of, for facilitating doing these kinds of analysis with ERP. So what you see here is the general main trend, the grand average. The little inset heads tell you where you see the same pattern and where that pattern is significant. So nothing much before stimulus onset. Then you can see this here. These two panels overlap for 100 milliseconds. These two overlap. So this here is basically this coming down, and this here is this here. So we are experimenting with what the right kind of bandwidth is to do an analysis on. But you can see nothing much. Then you have a negativity, positivity, and it goes negative a bit, and then nothing much happens. And then here you can see the effect of danger. In this case, there are a few electrodes where you can see something beginning to go positive for high danger words. Then if we look in the second epoch, you can see here it is high, and then there's low, and here that looks like a low, higher, low, high, a somewhat faster oscillation. This looks like a slow oscillation. These things are known from the literature. These are oscillations in the theta range, and things like that have been linked up to cognitive processes involved with language. Here you have something slow that seems to be going on for high danger words, and you can see that it is widespread, most somewhat right lateralized. There is some further, there's one note that I cannot resist adding. What is nice about these models is that they protect you against the assumption of linearity. There are models in the literature, especially Hauck in Cambridge has been proposing that these are so-called varying coefficient models. So at each time step, you fit a linear model, you get a slope and an intercept. Yeah. So you take, this is a graph actually that we have seen from a experiment in which pictures were presented, and here you have picture complexity, and here you have time. And what you can see is something that looks like an oscillation, sinusoidal oscillation in 2 dimensions. Yeah. So it's so down, down, but also up, down, up. And if you do a varying coefficient model on that, you take this data here in this slice and fit a straight line to it. And then you take the next slice and fit a straight line to it, and the next slice and a straight line to it. Now, here is a simulated data set to which I add noise, and then you get something like this. Yeah? So your slope first goes down and then up and down over time. Yeah? And if you look at these patterns, then you see that the assumption of linearity is very hazardous. If I take the same surface and shift it a little bit down, so this small patch is now a slightly bigger blue small patch, and I apply the same technique, then you can see that what looked like a nice change in slope is almost gone, even though the pattern is exactly the same one except shifted. Now, why is this? Basically, we're looking at, you know, convex, concave curvatures. And if you fit a straight line to that, then everything will depend on how those oscillations are positioned. And it tells you nothing about whether an effect is linear or not. So I think that the varying coefficient models are totally wrong for these data. What you need is something that is much more flexible and that allows you to deal and to detect nonlinear surfaces. Here is one final graph. In this case, what you see here is the red dots are the different electrodes. So this is the left part of the head, the right part of the head. Then here, this is the back of the head, this is the front of the head. And now what we are looking at is low danger words. We increase the danger, and then here we have the highest danger word. These little panels give us just the main trend, the main grand average for each of the electrodes. And now we can look across the whole measurement period for which we have data as to how the surface changes over time. And you can see that now the stimulus comes in, and at certain point you get huge negativities here for high frequency words that are not present for the high danger words that are not present for the low danger words. Yeah, so this is again an example of trying to visualize in more than just 3 dimensions. The animate package in R and the animate package in LaTeX together do this job in a very, very wonderful way. It's very easy. You just make, for every plot that you want to show, at every point in time, you make a separate little graph that is made easy for you by the animate package in R. And then in LaTeX, you use the animate package. And there's just a simple command that tells you which graphs to include in a nice and easy way. And then you can have these little films that display the data. You can include them in PDF documents. So this is a PDF document. I didn't have to download anything else. All the graphics are in the document. And I guess that we can even think about publishing these kind of things, because if you put a publication on the web, then you can have these animations in there, and then any reader can just click and see how the patterns unfold over time. Okay, so that is what I wanted to say. My final example is some eye tracking data. For eye tracking, I think GAMS have tremendous promise. Some of you may have worked with the visual world paradigm. So then you have your screen, and you put different objects on different positions on the screen, and then you play some auditory signal, and you trace where the eyes are looking. So you can use the GAMS to nicely model say what region the eye is looking at with under different conditions. What I'm showing you here are data from an eye tracking experiment where people are reading English compounds. One of the questions that we are interested in is what the semantic transparency of the compound might be doing. So we have fairly transparent compounds such as bookcase. There are somewhat less transparent compounds such as shoelace. You know, if you have a shoe, and if you think of what lace is, and then shoelace, then it's often a far cry from lace of what you have on your shoes. And then, of course, you have opaque compounds like hogwash, probably long ago transparent. I don't know whether you know the etymology of hogwash, but I never know whether the dictionary makers of etymological dictionaries have a great fantasy or not. But here the idea was that you had some wash, some liquid food that was fed to the hogs, and then by all kinds of extensions you get nonsense. Well, we're looking here at people reading these compounds in sentences. The I lands on the first constituent, so that could be hog, or shoe, or book. And there are no further fixations. The I moves out. Well, that's the majority of the cases. And if we take one's standard bag of predictors, then what seems to be determining this first fixation duration is the frequency of the head of the compound and also the latent semantic analysis score for the modifier in the head. So latent semantic analysis, that's this vector semantics of Landauer and his colleagues. There's a website at Boulder where you can just give words and it will tell you how strongly they are semantically related. We have those scores. We've tried lots of things. You can have a score for the modifier and the head. So you take hog and wash and you look at their semantic relation. Turns out that that is it correlates strongly with human ratings of how semantically transparent a compound is. So these two of all the different possible predictors are giving us a fairly decent regression model. However, there is also an interaction between these two predictors that you don't easily get with a standard multiplicative interaction, and it's shown here. So here you have the frequency of the head. Here you have the semantic relatedness. Here you can see that you go from high down, but here it reverses. Here you go from low to high. You can see that here you go from high to, so from long latencies to short latencies, but up here nothing much happens. Yeah, so this is the observed data. Now, the interaction that you see here is also present in the fixation durations that we can simulate with the naive discrimination model that the CADE model, Scrabble model that I mentioned earlier, and we get this. It's not totally the same. There's still too much going on compared to here, but then there's also no noise in the model. And I think it more or less captures the basic phenomenon. What is a bit frightening is that the way that the model gets at these simulated latencies is very different from what you would infer from the standard regressors. So we have a compound. There are lots of different things that could be at issue. The activation of the meaning of the modifier, that's what you're looking at. But ultimately your goal is the meaning of the compound. Nonsense for hogwash. We can look at the activation of the meaning of the head, all kinds of other things, but these two seem to be doing the work. This one with a slightly stronger weight, this one with a somewhat smaller weight, so there's basically two free parameters in this model, the weights of these two sets of meanings. And if we then go back and take those simulated latencies and we look at what predicts them, then it is this frequency and this LSA score that predict the latencies with this interaction. And I am both excited and disturbed because I have done a lot of work looking at different lexical predictors and trying to interpret from them. And now I'm seeing that some of the more complex surfaces that are emerging in the experiments actually might have rather different underlying causal structures than you would infer from just your regression predictors. And you know, if I were to interpret from this, then somehow you have to say, well, you know, why would the frequency of the head and the semantic relation of the modifier to the head be determining my reaction times? Well, maybe the head, that's the category of the compound, so bookcase is a kind of case. And then maybe it's also modified by the, so you're looking at the modifier and there's a semantic relation to the head, and maybe that is then propelling you forward to the head in a kind of spreading activation framework. Whereas this model basically says, well, you know, you're looking at the modifier, so the modifier's meaning is the most important, but the modifier is co-learned with the head with the compound meaning. So the compound's meaning is also important, and then you get that surface. So this is interesting that with the new kind of models that we can build, we also get new challenges of interpretation. So, final remarks. Generalized additive models, I think, are underused in our field, and I think they are a wonderful tool, and the tool is also becoming mature. So especially the modeling of random effect factors has been thoroughly revamped by Wood, and I think it's now really stable and good. Second thing is GAMS may discover more structure than you'd like. Yeah? You get wiggliness out where you hadn't expected it, and then there you are sitting with a headache trying to understand why things have the shape that they do have. So they challenge us, but I think that they're also fun. Final thing, would really like to acknowledge all the people that are involved in the research that I've been talking about. So it's Ingo Plaag and his group for the English compound stress, Victor Kuperman for the eye tracking data. The ERP stuff is done with Antoine Tremblay and Tatjana Kryuckova, Martin Wieling and John Arbon for the dialectometry stuff, and I think Simon Wood should be thanked also for all his wonderful work on the MGZV package. Thank you.
Composite quadratic polynomials for others, and yeah, and the tensor project products for others. And it wasn't clear to me what was motivating the decision for one of these or the other. Is that just is that just judgment call?
No. Let me. It's a wonderful question, and there is some. When you think about what is going on, so subjects will go through the experiment. You know, every subject has his own pattern of own ERP signature for any given word. So what we can try to do is to bring something of that subject-specific processing into the model, and as long as you're interested in the item properties, you can make that as precise as you want. So you can build a smooth for subject with as many parameters as you want, and you'll still be fine. When it comes to the items, you have to be careful, because we are interested in the item properties. Now you can do two things. You can either say, okay, I'm going to have for each item an own smooth, and we invest lots of parameters in that. Then there will be nothing here, because everything is already taken care of by that big item smooth. Then in order to interpret what is going on, you have to start looking at the coefficients of your basis functions, which is a pain. You don't want that. So what I generally do is that I just give it random intercepts for item, but you can also do a low order polynomial smooth, and then you will still be able to pick up the theta oscillations with the tensor products. But it's really, you know, if you do a 4th or 5th order polynomial on a small interval, then you can start analyzing the coefficients of your polynomials, and I've done that. And then you come to similar conclusions. But I think it's much more straightforward to not do that in the item smooths and do that with the tensor products. So that's behind this.
Okay, thanks. And my other question was, I've been using GAMS in a much more limited way in my own work, and been doing model comparisons using the AIC and the VIC. If I were to try to suggest to my psychologist friends who are doing eye tracking to use GAMS, they need a p-value, right? Because that's the dividing line between fact and not fact. So how are you doing your model comparisons to get p-values, or is there a way, or do they just need to relax about that?
No, there are any GAM model comes with lots of p-values, so you get p-values for your smooth terms. So suppose that we have a vector with levels a and b, and then you have some tensor. You can have different tensor surfaces for the different levels of your vector. Yeah, it's very, very easy. And for each vector level, you have your own surface, and sometimes one is just flat and the other is wiggly. So you can see from how many parameters it invests in wiggliness, whether it's going to be highly wiggly or not at all. You also get individual p-values that tell you whether that surface, whether it is really worth investing in nonlinearities. So that information is already there. But the goal of generalized additive modeling is, of course, as always, to get the simplest possible model. And that means that you want to compare a model without all that wiggliness with a model that has, say, a tensor product extra. And that's what you can do with the ANOVA function in R. You build the one model, you build the other, and for the GAM model, you have to explicitly mention whether you want an f-test for, say, standard Gaussian models or a chi-square test for binomial models. That's what you do. And often, you know, sometimes you can see that, yes, you have told the model to look for a nonlinearity, a nonlinear surface, it has found one, but if that model invests more parameters and actually the AIC goes up rather than down, you know that you have been forcing it into a direction where you don't want to go. So the whole goal of the game is to keep these models as simple as possible, but to allow for these nonlinear interactions. And I've seen cases where, you know, the AIC has dropped by 50 or 60 units simply by including these kind of interactions. That's a lot in terms of AIC. It makes the models a lot better. But yeah, all the model comparison can be done. And another tricky thing to keep in mind is that if you have, say, random slopes for item, then bringing in a nonlinearity on the items may not always be necessary, because the random intercepts for item already can absorb a lot of what needs to be done. But then you can suddenly see that you have a new model that uses a fraction, say a 20th of a parameter extra, but doesn't give you anything better than already a model with the random slopes in. There's another complication here, and that is that, as far as I know, it is not easy and not straightforward to think about random adjustments to the surfaces. Yeah? So if you think of what a random effect factor is, the random intercepts just move your graph for an item or a subject up or down along, and it's a translation along the vertical axis. Slopes are adjustments to the slopes. And you can say, okay, we sample, we have a particular slope, and we have normally distributed changes from that slope. But if you think about a tensor product, we have one basis function, we have another basis function. If you would put random noise on the slopes of those, on the coefficients of those basis functions, you will get random surfaces. Not just small modulations of a particular surface, you will get very, very different surfaces. So there is a philosophical problem here that what works for just random slopes and random intercepts doesn't generalize straightforwardly to these wiggly surfaces. So right now I try to bring in as much as I can in terms of random slopes and intercepts for the linear terms, but then we have our tensor products, which I just take as descriptors of the general pattern.
Perhaps we could continue discussion over coffee. We do have a break coming up, but we'd like to resume at 10:45. So, Cecile, sorry to... Thanks very much again, Harald.